Welcome, everybody. This is Illiterate. My name is Evan.
My name is Taylor. I read a book this week.
I watched a movie. This week, we are covering Harriet. Harriet. It was a 2019 film about Harriet Tubman, the first feature film ever about Harriet Tubman. It was released onto HBO on July 18th, just this past weekend. First off, I didn't really know all that much about Harriet Tubman. I've heard the folklore, and I feel like there's kind of a general, public awareness of, this is the A to B to C story of Harriet Tubman, and it kind of like falls into this almost fairy tale like kind of area.
And like I saw, most people, you think of Harriet Tubman and you picture the one picture that they have of her, which is an old woman in a shawl, formally sitting down,
like
somber
at the end
looking.
Of her life.
Yeah. And people are like, oh, well, that's the sugar-coated
This old lady did all that? Her?
Or like you said, it's like, oh, is she even a real person? Or is it sort of this Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Johnny Appleseed America?
Right, which is the most, I think the most frightening of the outlooks on her, because like a very real documented person.
Yeah. So I looked into and wanted to discuss who she is, how she came to be that way in our consciousness, what the movie is trying to do, and interestingly, how it fits into literarily in the same way that like this is the first feature film to feature her. There isn't hardly any literary works featuring her either.
Really?
So where did our perception of this come from?
Yeah. I'm fascinated to know. I mean, I feel like this is a story I remember being taught in elementary school, probably 3rd or 4th grade. I just don't remember anything along the lines of what's depicted into this film. And so watching the film, I go, there's so much detail to this that I'm where in the world has this been hiding, or where did it come from? Just off the bat, before we get too deep into it, the director is Kasi Lemmons. She's a director and an actor. As a director, most notably known for Eve's Bayou, got her massive critical acclaim in the 90s. She's also been an actor. She was an actress in the original Silence of the Lambs and Candyman. And it was co-written with Gregory Allen Howard. He's the writer of Remember the Titans. It came out last year in November. It did garner 2 Academy Award nominations, both involving Cynthia Erivo. She is the main character, Harriet Tubman. She was nominated for Best Actress for Harriet Tubman and Best Original Song for the song Stand Up for Harriet. So it did garner some pretty big acclaim, but somehow it just kind of flew under the radar a bit. And I think that was one reason we wanted, in the middle of the social moment that we're having right now, going back and trying to understand some of these figures and why these stories haven't been told or been told in particular ways. And this has been in the news this week. So
I had
here
seen
we are.
That the only other works that I could find that were about Harriet Tubman in the film world is a woman called Moses, which was a 1978 miniseries on NBC. And then recently there was a 2016 TV series called Underground about the Underground Railroad. And
that's the thing I think I grabbed. Yeah. Number one, there's hardly anything on it. But I think the thing, as far as like the way this was told to me or taught to me, the Underground Railroad, and especially being taught that as a 3rd grader, like that is not a clear topic. It's not a clear like depiction of like what. There's no locomotive,
right?
And as a 3rd grader, I'm like, that's really hard to get across or like understand the people, how they travel, stuff like so I think
the
that's
concepts behind it all.
Yeah, exactly. So part of the thing that I found most fascinating about really getting in to see this for real, because the idea of the Underground Railroad is this mythic idea of a watch by night thing that just happened, and it's really hard to conceptualize. So I was really excited to see that committed to film.
Yeah, speaking to kind of the abstractness of thematics that they were going for with the movie that then get realized. And I had seen Kasi Lemmons, who is the director, a big part of it that she wanted to get across was more that it was a story about freedom, and that's what's exhilarating, and kind of focusing it as a action hero story.
Right.
Versus the other slavery-based stories filmically that have been going around recently. She was not as interested in presenting that.
Right. It seemed to be much more about the spinning of breaking free, that kind of kinetic energy, the actual journey outward, not about where you started. It was very much about what was in front of you. Not underplaying the brutality of what was going on at all, but the focus is where she was going, the
Right. And
journey.
if those are the criticisms that you see lobbed against it, they knew that, and that was intentional to the
Hmm.
message of the movie, because she was
Interesting.
saying it was about a love of family. It's about family separation, that
Yes.
particular
Yes.
small universal element of this. And I think that's one of the myths, which I'll bring up as we go on. But a big part of this was for her family. So Harriet Tubman was one of 10 kids. Most of the people she went back for were her families, her nieces and nephews, her parents she brought back. So it was like that was
Right.
her primary drive before this big, grand, lofty, universal goal. It was just, I got to get my family out of there.
It's so interesting how these things start. When these people that end up doing something so big, it starts, so small in a way. It was really impressive to see how her motivations evolved, because it starts with, I'm going to die right now if I don't move. It evolves to, I've got to go back and get the rest of them. Then it evolves to, I've got to teach them how to make it like I made it, just the same way.
Hmm.
It's very much a big snowball. The momentum. I think the film does an incredible job of actually depicting that momentum inside her.
I also thought just Cynthia, who plays Harriet Tubman, she was saying that she had worked hard to capture her physicality. And she was saying, like, trying to look at the pictures that they do have, discuss her eyes, how she would hold her body,
Mm,
where her tension was, figuring out her voice. Because she was like, I know that I'm not Harriet Tubman. She doesn't
right.
sound like me. How do I get those elements? And I found in looking at, like we had talked about, our perceptions of Harriet Tubman, there was a new photo that was found of Harriet Tubman in
Mm,
2017, and she is around age 45. But Kasi Lemmons had seen this photo, and it put the whole thing in a different light because it helped really connect her to the story of her heroics. And if you can see our
right.
podcast episode cover art for this episode, I've used that picture. And I believe it's also used at the
It
very, very
is.
end of the film.
It is the final image of the film before it goes to credits. It's pretty staggering. I've never seen it before, and it immediately takes you one step beyond any image you think you've seen of her. Takes you to a new place. This is an authentic image of her, and oddly enough, it connects you right back into the character you've been watching for the last 2 hours. It really does a good job of intimately making that bridge and being like, okay, what you just watched, here she is. Here she is in a way you've never seen her before, actually. It was really
Mhm.
amazing.
So that ties us into the book and this author, Kate Clifford Larson, who was used as the historical consultant. The book that I read is just
Hmm,
called Bound for the Promised Land, came out in 2003. Briefly, her story, and then why we don't have a lot of material about this stuff, let
interesting.
alone pictures or anything. This gal, Kate Clifford Larson, was working at a bank in the 90s. She had her MBA in business. She was like, I don't want to do business. She went back to get her master's in women's history. And at this time, her daughter, which is interesting that you bring up elementary school, because her daughter was in the second grade, came
Mhm.
home with a children's biography of Harriet Tubman. And Kate Larson is like, well, I'm doing this degree in women's history. I should probably look into Harriet Tubman. She tried to look for an adult biography of Harriet Tubman, and the
Yeah.
last one written was in the 1940s.
What?
Yeah. So
In
she was like,
in
"Well,
the
I've gotta."
1990s, the most recent adult literary option was
Mhm.
published in the 1940s.
Yeah.
Just if for our audience that might be following along, we keep seeing this idea of a specific, even back, bringing Hamilton into the mix, of who's going to tell your story, why stories are told, how they cross hands, and I think that's particularly important. And I hope that more of these things start to percolate to the surface,
Mhm.
because we can make these things, we can get these things seen, we can drag them out into the light.
So this gal, Kate Larson, ends up being the one who's like, "Well, I'm gonna do my dissertation on Harriet Tubman. I'm gonna go back to these primary sources. I'm gonna try and find out as much as I can from what's available about this." The main primary source that we have for before this 1940s piece is a biography that was written about Harriet Tubman in 1869 by Sarah Hopkins Bradford, who was sort of an acquaintance friend of
Okay.
Harriet Tubman's. And it was believed to be embellished heavily in an effort to sell. So it's not really reputed by historians.
Hmm.
So Kate Larson, I mean, you really have to go back into the research of documents and whatnot. It's also hard because, as we'll see, Harriet Tubman's work was to not be figured out who she was.
Right.
Otherwise,
I
she
mean,
couldn't do her thing.
if you are a spy, if you're a Union
Or a
spy,
fugitive
if
from,
you're a
yeah,
fugitive, yeah, it might not be the best idea for you to be just like widely known exactly what your identity is and where you preside.
yeah,
Um,
and or even if she was being the voice of something, because also she could not her entire life read or write. So anything that she did have, other people would have had to have put down. We
right,
see in Hamilton's stuff, it was so much related to the correspondence and letters, but she
right.
didn't even have the ability or the
To do that firsthand,
need
yeah.
or want, or it would have been detrimental if there were a bunch of letters that had her name on them and where she was and what she was doing. So it doesn't really help that the only official biography of her is filled with a bunch of nonsense as far as what she actually did, what the numbers were, where she was, any of that stuff, to make it more interesting to people.
Interesting.
I looked into, based on the book and whatnot, some of the inconsistencies are things we think we do and don't know because, like we said, since there's no real sources, the only way anybody's ever heard about Harriet Tubman is through children's books,
In the world.
which is a crazy thing to say, but it's true. Like anything you've ever heard about Harriet Tubman has not come from film, as we know, and has not
No.
come from biographies.
No, there's no major, there's no, best-selling New York Times, go pick up and go to the library and just, "Oh, okay, here it is all documented," and it's like, and it just doesn't exist, which seems bizarre because I got taught this in 3rd and 4th grade. I guess I assume that most anything I'm taught at that age, I can probably go look up somewhere else. Well, Harriet Tubman's an odd case. There's just very, very little
Mhm.
real information. So I'm really interested what this author did going past that. How did she get past the major biography being uncredible to a degree?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit of the 1940s one was that man was still alive. A lot of the people that could substantiate, because Harriet Tubman died in
1913.
1913. Yeah, so there were still people around that he could talk to. Wasn't as popular of a book, but it comes down to a lot
He
of
had real
secondary
sources.
a lot of secondary sources. The gal who wrote the 1869 biography would not publish anything if there were not sources corroborating what Harriet Tubman had said, which was an interesting case because it's like Harriet Tubman was probably like, you had the source there, but she wasn't willing to put in information that couldn't have been substantiated by other people.
What in the world?
So it's like, honestly, if we had just gotten somebody who was willing to listen and write down what Harriet Tubman had said, it would have probably been more factual, or at least more true to what was happening in her life.
Weird.
Yeah. So let's talk about going through her life and then dispelling some of the myths and whatnot, and what the movie has put in that is or isn't based
Hmm.
on real stuff. Born, we don't know when, between 1820 and 25.
Mm.
Araminta Ross was her name. She changed her name. She was born in Dorchester County, Maryland, defied orders as a youth, so was moved from domestic work, which most of the women were doing, to punishing labor in the fields.
Oh,
And the irony of that is that her familiarity with the land proved helpful down the line. She was involved in everything that the men were doing, the logging efforts, maritime efforts down at the docks. She saw it all. So she had
man,
a
yeah.
strong familiarity. She would have been completely useless if she had just
Deep
been
under
relegated to
Yeah, deep
domestic work.
understanding of the operations, what
Mhm.
would be going on when outside.
It's also interesting that she got to see, because, like I said, she was illiterate her whole life. She got to see the functions of, because she worked with a lot of freed black people who worked on boats and in other parts of society, which is harder for us to conceptualize. But like, she was married to a free black man.
Right.
And so it was a bit more confusing and intermingling into how society worked in that way. It wasn't just like, you're
The
over here,
film
you're over
tries
there.
to the film tries to depict that and tries to do it pretty upfront. That's part of the initial conflict, is that her free husband has hired a lawyer, I believe, and just
Mhm.
tried to negotiate her freedom based on a previous agreement with the whole family was supposed to be freed by a certain point, and he's gone back on that deal, and so now her husband has hired a lawyer to
Right.
lawfully force her release.
Yeah.
So they tried to depict that right off the bat. Then later on, when she actually makes it to freedom and then starts to go back south, it does a good job of trying to depict what that looks like, running into other freed slaves, and the kind of the trying to comment on the black mindset and the varied black mindsets in the country at that
Hmm.
time, because not everybody was slaves. And how do you operate and how do you
Yeah.
feel
Yeah. So all of
knowing
that
that your
stuff.
people are enslaved?
Hmm.
And what are your avenues and routes and opportunities laid out to you? It does a good job of trying to display a bunch of different points of views for black people at this time who
Hmm.
are and aren't slaves. I thought that was particularly interesting.
Yeah.
I've seen so little about free black Americans at this time and what their hardships and emotions were, what their choices were, their options were at
Yeah.
this time, because you can either help or hurt or I try to be neutral. That's just a place I'd never really thought about or considered. And this film does a good job of bringing that up.
Yeah, so all that stuff with her husband being a free man and hiring a lawyer, all of that is pretty much true to what actually happened.
Mm,
And like I said, in terms of her being a youth and being involved and seeing all of the exterior workings and seeing she gained a better literacy for communication without needing to read or write because
yeah.
she could understand a subtle hand gesture or a movement or a song lyric or something that
Well,
would
interesting you said that,
yeah.
because I had heard an interview with Cynthia saying that they had found record of her using her voice, her singing voice, as code, using particular pieces of hymns and lyrics of songs
Mhm.
as phrase, as code of "I'm going, I'm leaving, it's too early, not yet." All those types of
Right.
code work that you hear on the wind, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah, so
Really,
she
really fascinating. I never considered that before, and it's also interesting just as far as the casting goes, because Cynthia is obviously a Grammy winning singer.
Mhm.
So that goes into the character here. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. All of that stems from her growing up and being defiant and being forced to do the harder work
Yeah,
outside allows her the ability to pick up on all those things that then
yeah.
she later uses to help other people. So, a situation that happens when she's 13 years old is she was hit by a weight and I guess hit her on the head.
Oh gosh.
And it wasn't even aimed at her, but it missed this other person and hit her. So that's where perhaps a medical issue of her having narcolepsy or epilepsy or some
Oh,
facet
fascinating.
of that medical condition comes
That's
from the issue in her childhood.
interesting. Yeah. So in the film, there are flashes periodically where she has these kinds of emotional, intense, almost, just these visions
Mhm.
that of past trauma and even future trauma at that point. And so that's interesting. I don't think they had. I hate to say maybe I missed something, but I don't think they directly say that these visions are because of past physical abuse and injury directly, but
Yeah. Well,
these
now
these
we know,
visions come
I
up as
mean
like an emotional,
mhm.
PTSD comes up periodically through the film. This is just an emotional like exercise that she goes through that are really affecting. But I didn't know that was really
Yeah.
I would write that into anything, like just to get emotionally somewhere.
Right.
Like, oh, they're having an epiphany.
Well, I know that
But
also
like, but that's based
yeah.
in truth. That's
Yeah.
really interesting.
And also I know Casey and Cynthia are fairly religious, and so they were drawing from and obviously Harriet Tubman was drawing
Oh
from that
yes.
spiritual religious energy, but, Leslie Odom Jr., who plays another character who we'll get to, said, even if you don't believe or buy into that and you wanna go the other way, you could just also consider it part of her instincts, part of
Mm,
her
mm,
physical ability to
yeah.
nuance and pick up on things if you weren't into the visions element of it. But yeah, now we know that there potentially is some medical reason behind it as well, or what people
Oh
were like,
wow.
oh, she's having these visions. No, she's having seizures, you
Gosh.
know, that could also be a part of it, which is also amazing. The fact that she had that her whole life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whoever,
Good
like,
lord.
oh, the story of Harriet Tubman. Did you know that she had narcolepsy and epilepsy?
She's like bulletproof, dude.
Yeah.
She looks like I don't know. I love finding out so much beautiful detail on some of these people you thought you knew.
Mhm.
Some of these characters in history that oh yeah, yeah, Harriet Tubman. Like, hold on.
Yeah.
This is really down into the nitty gritty. This is what the film is good for, is really humanizing a historical figure and letting you a window into what were their wants and loves and
Mhm.
feelings, really humanizing them on a personal level.
Off of that, her human elements, what she was striving for, the big defining moment in her childhood after this incident was the sale of 3 of her sisters who went to the
Mm.
Deep South. Like I said, they were in Maryland, and they were never heard from again. There's no historical record
Oh
of
my
where they
gosh.
went to, any of that stuff, which really, really hit her. The situation with the lawyer happens, and by March of 1849, there are rumors saying that they are going to sell her and her siblings. So
Oh
she
god.
prays, and this is, I believe, in the movie, but 1 week later, her master, Brodus, dies, leaving her family at the mercy of his widow. So she realizes, oh, this whole area is in debt. We've got this crazy widow lady who knows what she's going to do with us. So
Right.
that's where she plans on fleeing. Her 2 of her brothers are on board. They turn back because they also have
Mm.
family. They're worried about what's going to happen. They think, oh, it's much better to potentially get sold to somebody in this area. Maybe she won't sell us so far south. Like it's just not worth the risk to them. So she
Right.
goes on her own, which is traveling 100 miles by herself up to Philadelphia,
Yeah.
which I looked up because that's also part of the story. Like you hear about this, and if you're in elementary school, time and distance means nothing to you.
Right.
But if you just walked in a straight line 100 miles, it would take you 33 hours
Good god.
to walk. And she doesn't know the area. She doesn't
She
know
doesn't know
the people
anything,
there. She's also, and this comes back to that picture that they found in 2017, she's 27 years old when she decides to do this.
God.
So now she meets up with this guy, William Still, who is, as we mentioned, Leslie Odom Jr.'s character. He is real.
Plays Aaron Burr in Hamilton from just a couple weeks ago.
He, the real character, used meticulous records to write accounts of the Underground Railroad system, it is a book called The Underground Railroad Records. It was published in 1872, still available. It has 649 stories of escaped slaves and their various
Oh,
methods,
man.
and it's probably the biggest resource that anybody ever had.
Oh, that's awesome. I have
It's
never heard of
yeah.
that before.
It's wild though because Harriet Tubman has like a page in it. It's not much at all.
Oh, really?
And it also makes you realize, oh, this is a much bigger thing that, it's like the elementary school story of she saved
She
the
freed all
South.
the
Yeah,
slaves.
yeah. Like, no, yeah. This is a giant,
Which
giant
isn't okay. It's not the reason, but it's kind of the reason. But isn't that what Kanye said? We didn't even bother looking at it. Part of why we did this is because Kanye said something about Harriet Tubman. So we were like, wait, there's a movie, and it had just been released on HBO. So we were like, well, let's do Harriet. I'm pretty sure that's what he's like angry about. It's like she didn't free all the slaves. Like, oh god,
I don't know. I didn't even look into it.
I
But yeah,
didn't even bother.
these are the myths. Some of the other ones were that all the amount of trips that she took. She did still take 13 total trips up and back, and went as far as
Terrifying. That's horrifying. I can't
Yeah.
imagine going back once. Like that's I think going back once sounds like a death sentence, and she went back 13 times.
Mm-hmm. And then went as far north as Canada, since the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 gave bounty hunters the power to bring slaves back, even if they had made it over the Mason-Dixon line.
Oh my god.
Yeah. It was exaggerated because of this original biography that she had, done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people over dozens and dozens of missions. She never used that number. It was estimated around 70 people in that decade, and another 70 she had guided and helped indirectly through her abilities and efforts. So still a ton of people. And like I said, in terms of the thematics of this
is all pre-Civil War, and then her
Right.
work expands actually into the Civil War, and she ends up becoming way more responsible for a lot more freed slaves.
Yeah.
But as far as the Underground Railroad work goes, it's confirmed 70, a questionable another
70.
another 70.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay. And then that is pre-Civil War. Then there's a whole other metric here after
Yeah.
Civil War.
Yeah.
or
Just
during Civil War.
yeah, yeah. Just quickly into the Underground Railroad stuff, some of the misconceptions there, because that's even more mythology to
Yeah.
it, where it's like that it was all just terminology. It was all code used. There's no actual Underground Railroad. Interestingly, also, actual Underground Railroads like subways, trains that they'd build tunnels for did not exist until 1863. So there wasn't even a precedent for people to think that that would be a thing.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
that didn't exist at all.
Yeah, the first London tube
Yeah.
station was in 1863, so that wasn't even a real thing. I thought just tying into film and the Underground Railroad and literature, there was a book that came out in 2016 called The
Hmm.
Underground Railroad, written by this guy Colson Whitehead. It's an alternate history where there's a literal underground train.
Oh, no.
Very, very cool. Won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction the next year. Got bought for the film world. Amazon is making it as a limited series.
Really?
And filming was taking place in February, obviously coronavirus stuff,
Ah.
but it actually got to the filming stage. So it's like it
Yeah.
will be
Yeah, it's
coming out.
happening.
Written and directed by Barry Jenkins, who did Moonlight.
Whoa! Okay, now I'm interested.
Yeah.
I'm interested.
So lots of connections there. But if you were confused by what actually the Underground Railroad was, there is something that's being made that is
They're gonna
taking it
try
as
to
if it
help you
was
figure that out.
a literal thing. Yeah.
Help you go realize that the thing you've been, like, imagining in your head is ridiculous when you see it up on the TV screen.
Mhm.
They'll go, "See? This is a metaphor."
Yeah. So let's move on, like you said, to the Civil War stuff. Since this was what she was doing, she did carry a gun. That's what the movie brings to bear. Like, she's not the dowdy
Wild.
old
It
woman.
was
Yeah.
okay, it is insane to see out of nowhere Harriet Tubman just whip out a pistol or hold it to someone's head and, like, she's gonna do
Yeah.
it. Like, that's where, and it's like not just one time
Mm-mm.
that happens. It's not like the climax of the film or anything. It's like something like that happens like maybe like 4 or 5 times. She is nothing short of, I mean,
A badass.
I didn't want to say it. She is. That's where dramatically, that's where it gets you to more than a couple times.
So now she has gone through all of that. The Underground Railroad is at an end because we are entering the Civil War, where this is what it is built to. Now
Right.
the nation is at war. She first worked as a nurse in the Civil War. She went down to South Carolina.
Mm,
She was not paid for this and was a entrepreneur, which is interesting when people talk about putting her on the $20 bill.
right.
Like, she supported herself this whole time also while she's working with the Underground Railroad. She has bought property in New York. Like, she is doing,
Good Lord.
fine as a
Yeah.
person. But in the Civil War, she ran eating houses. She did baking. She did laundry to support herself since she was not compensated. She taught other people who it's like, hey, if we're going to get out of this, you've got to figure out how to do your thing too. So she was able
Hmm.
to sustain herself by being an entrepreneur during the Civil War.
Maybe she had. I mean, if you gain your freedom, maybe you're going to exercise that freedom in just about every imaginable way.
Yeah.
And maybe that should be a lesson to some of us. I mean, maybe we don't. Maybe we don't live as freely as maybe is available to us. I mean,
Hmm.
I've never, I don't know, but I could save more. Is what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
You know?
Do more.
I could do more. I have
Yeah.
more freedoms that are allowed to me than I'm taking advantage of.
Yeah. So part of her Civil War stuff, like I said, she started off as a nurse. Then they realized, oh, she can do a really good job at being a Union spy. Doesn't know the area of South Carolina, but knows how to move through an area.
Right.
So she was sailing along waterways, taking notes of enemy positions and movements, communicating the information back to the leaders. One of the big things that she did was in the Combahee River Raid, which took place in 1863. So a lot of people don't know this as one of her monikers, but she is the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military expedition.
And this is depicted fully in the film.
Hmm.
This is the last third of the film, but this is fully realized, and it's pretty staggering to see the steamboats out on the waterfront behind her as they're pulling off this raid.
Yeah.
It's something I would have loved to have seen in a history class. That's one thing I was watching this going, being like, man, I wish something like this existed for more historical topics that at least just like are
Yeah.
fully realized,
Yeah.
really placing you in the time and period. Seeing, I mean, alone, seeing the steamboats fully realized was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Just
It
a
gives you
visual,
some context. Yeah.
a Civil War visual I've never seen done to that scale, that
Hmm.
quality before.
Yeah.
It was really cool to see.
So she's also now still being a nurse and being a spy and leading out scouts to map various regions. The goal of this particular Combahee River raid was to destroy Confederate supply lines. They had put mines in this river. So their
Whoa.
goal was to disable, she called them torpedoes in her biography, but they're mines,
Mm-hmm.
and cripple the plantations that are along the shore of this river by
Oh
either setting
wow.
fire to their granaries and doing just
Yeah.
general mayhem to stop all of this. Another part of it, which then was realized in doing this, is rescuing the more than 700 enslaved people
Yeah.
that are also on these lands. So when the gunboats approached, slaves came pouring onto the shore where rowboats are now waiting to bring them up to the
This is the
ships.
scene in the
And
film.
that's
Yeah.
what she's involved in. And the movie, you know, she was not the commanding officer general of it, but she was
Of
at
the
the helm of
entire
this.
operation, but
Right.
yes, she was at the forefront of it.
Right. And she was in charge of helping the enslaved people get their way onto the
Get there,
boats
yeah.
and onto, and she
Yeah,
was
she was really on the
responsible
front line, yeah. She
for
might not have
disabling.
been the person in charge, but she was actually there on the front line making this happen, leading the charge for real.
Yeah, yeah, because she was responsible for what had been scouted ahead and stopping the torpedo mines that had been in front of everything. She was the one who did all of that.
You know, again, on those kind of those dramatic windows that artists have to, make those decisions. Everything up until this point is kind of setting the record straight of like, okay, this is what the Underground Railroad was. This was her. Um,
Yeah,
Also separate from this, what she did here, actually in the Civil War, freeing over 700 slaves, saying this happened. She led a military operation that freed hundreds and hundreds of slaves
yeah,
all at once. The first woman period to lead a military operation. I think the film goes out of its way to say, oh, rewrite the history, straighten out the history for you on the Underground Railroad, but then say, also, you probably didn't even know this happened
hmm
at all.
right. And all the other stuff that
that's
she
where it
did,
gets.
yeah. How you
That's
don't
where it
just,
gets to
yeah,
the point where it feels almost unbelievable. Like she is a superhero. You're like, no, moment for moment, there's nothing unbelievable. It feels very authentic. It's very dramatic, but it feels very real. But when you get to this the last third of the film, and it is this big, and you've come this far, it becomes larger than life.
hmm
And again, and like you even hesitated to say it aggrandizes this scene of her coming off with these steamboats, with these these rowboats to save these hundreds of slaves. I mean, but what else does that look like? And
right.
I'm thinking, well, how did they, because I had the same feeling of like, yeah, they aggrandized it, they made it feel bigger than it was. But when I go back and look at the images that they shot, I'm like, well, these are just the pieces that were there that would have
Yeah,
been, like I'm like it feels aggrandized, but I can't tell you in what fashion, in what way. I think that is just a testament to how massive the accomplishment really is. I mean, it
right.
seems unbelievable that it happened, period.
hmm
But it did.
Yeah. Speaking to more, like you said, it's like, oh, well, we don't even think what we're told that she did, let alone the stuff that we don't know.
Right.
She stayed in the South for another year in the Civil War, assisting.
Whoa.
She went on to work with, and we mentioned this in our The Five Bloods episode
Hmm.
about African Americans in U.S. military history. So the
Right.
Massachusetts 54th, which was the Frederick Douglass effort, which was featured in the film Glory, she was there. She was a
Oh
nurse.
man. What? No way.
Yeah, in that in that
That's
battle.
amazing.
So she was involved in everything. And
She's involved in everything. There's more done than seems possible for one person.
mhm,
Her accomplishments are unmatched. I mean, on paper, just unmatched. I mean, good luck. I mean,
yeah,
is this why she ends up falling into this odd mythic Johnny Appleseed
right.
lullaby fairy tale area? I don't understand I'm so thankful for something like this movie actually coming along and saying, "Whoa, hold on, very real, uh,
Right.
very real," and we ought to be telling this story as as a purely American. This is an American story, man.
Mhm.
Good Lord.
Yeah. So beyond the Civil War then, and I don't know if the movie can only really put this into text before the credits, but she
Mm,
still now has an entire half of a life left.
right.
She worked as
Before we get that one photo that we all know for
yeah,
at the
yeah.
end of.
She worked as a suffragist. 1869 was when the National Women's Suffrage Association was created by Susan B. Anthony,
Wow.
Elizabeth
Yeah.
Cady Stanton. The goal was to amend the Constitution. So Harriet Tubman, obviously strong supporter, toured, gave speeches,
Wow.
explained what she had done for women and what she had done for the country,
Yeah.
and supported that movement. Big part of her life at some point in the 1890s, she had neurosurgery done
What?
on her brain because it was just getting so bad and she couldn't sleep.
Oh man.
And
They were doing a type of
well, so here's what
neurosurgery in the
happened.
late 1800s?
Not really.
What in
She
the
they
world?
they just cut open her head. She refused the anesthesia and chewed a bullet like the amputee soldiers that she had seen in the Civil War.
She is a
She
badass.
was
Oh
like,
my
they
god,
cut my
she
head,
is a
moved something
legit
around, and now it feels better. And
Oh my
with
god.
no medicine.
I love like she is
Yeah.
a superhero, dude.
Then in 1908, 5 years before her death, she purchases land and donates it to this church that she was a member of and wanted them to
Mm,
operate this home for the elderly, which then
mm,
she was an elderly person being cared for in that home and died in March of 1913 at the age of around 90. Remember, we don't
wow.
even know when she was born, so we don't even
Right.
know how old she was, and was buried with military honors in
Hell
New
yes.
York for her
Yes.
efforts. Rounding out all this stuff that we learned, I thought it was interesting tying into the lack of information, as it's somewhat of a mystery. And in the book, the author couldn't even really put much to it. But as to her leadership, because she's not a public figure, but bits and pieces of, if you were a part of the abolitionist in crowd, are a
Right.
testament to her genius. Like, one of the things everybody mentioned, or enough people mentioned for it to be like, well, this has to be a facet of her dry sense of humor, her
Oh,
candor, like
really?
her ability as an orator. And it's like, yeah, that makes sense. She had to have been able to relate with people
Right.
because that was her whole life. That's the biggest thing that was crazy to me, and mentioned it several times, but it still goes without saying that's like, she was illiterate. She could not read or write anything down.
Yeah.
That is crazy that, like, all
Yeah.
the stuff she did, she never read or wrote anything. And they were saying,
God.
like, she had an amazing memory. She had, like, the ability to recite anything, like all the names and places. And, like, also, if she couldn't read words, like, she could read a landscape, she could read the night sky, she could read people. Like,
Yeah.
she had so
Yeah.
much.
Oh, she couldn't read words, man, but she read you. She read the world, it sounds like. I
Mhm.
mean, she's illiterate when it comes to, I mean, actually, words and those things, but I mean, proficient when it comes to people.
Yeah, and that's
And
why it's sort of there's unveiling a little bit of the mystery of, like, why isn't there much about her? And it's like, 'cause somebody else has to do it. She wasn't the one
yeah,
to put it onto the page or put it onto the screen. Like, she was just living. She was the backbone of it
right.
all.
It is not just one person and then she put out a book and then it's
Right.
just a bestseller. It is so much more than that. It is, who do you come into contact during your journey and who are you impacting? She impacted uncounted people, but I think that you would be doing a disservice to say, I mean, she is a black woman in the 1800s going into the 1900s. I think it's a miracle that her story survived. I think it's a miracle that what we do know,
Yeah.
and I think this is a call. The moment that we're living through is to do better about this. To realize our real history, other parts of our real history, creating a fuller picture of our history, and doing better moving forward. Understanding what what we're really made of. Well, thank you so much, Taylor. There's so much that I think I took for granted about all of this. I wish that I had checked out the film last year, but I'm glad that it has come back to our attention now. So I hope that this sparked your interest. Harriet is on HBO, and it should be going to everywhere pretty soon.
Please check out the links in the description. Check out the show notes for all of the resources. Check out the cover art so you can see the picture that was just found recently of a young Harriet Tubman.
And we will catch you next week.